Diana, are you on mute? Did my audio cut out? Diana, are you speaking?
I was. I'm not able to get, hang on, let me put it in. It's not letting me, there we go.
I can hear you now.
Okay.
And you were sharing the screen.
Yeah. So how do I get to the other, where it's just the slide?
When you click share screen, there should be window options to choose from.
Okay, so you've got the slide only, right? Not
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So sorry about that, guys. I did this last week and I guess I just forgot how to do it. All right, so now we're going to talk about how the flood insurance is affected by everything that you do in your day-to-day operations. How does it affect the cost of flood insurance? How does it affect the risk? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how floodplain management and flood insurance work together, or in some cases don't. So federal flood insurance is only available in communities that have adopted and are enforcing floodplain management requirements based on maps that we provide. They are participating communities. So flood insurance is available for all insurable buildings. And we talked yesterday about, well, what is an insurable building? Whether it's for NFIP insurance, it's 2 walls and a roof, principally above ground. Now, as different from a homeowner's policy that includes building and contents, under the NFIP, you have to purchase these coverages separately. Well, it can be on one policy, but you have to purchase building and then you have to purchase contents. Under the definition of a building, we can move 10% of the building over to cover a detached garage, not a carport, but a detached garage, as long as it's got 2 walls and a roof. Other buildings, appurtenant, we call them appurtenant structures, or other structures, sheds, barns, cabanas, things like this, have to be insured under a separate policy. And flood insurance is a single peril policy. We cover flood. Now, as we'll see in a minute what the definition of flood is, it is surface water flooding. So it could be from an overflow of a stream, or it could actually be a mud flow, which is what we're concerned right now with our floods after fire and debris or mud flows when there is even just a little bit of rain. Flood insurance is under the NFIP, is separate from most and not included in most homeowners policies. Some of the private policies now you can endorse flood, but that is not NFIP coverage. So again, under the NFIP, definition of a building is a walled and roofed building, including a manufactured home that is principally above ground and affixed to a permanent foundation. Here's where we have our 2 or more rigid walls, and the roof is secured so that the building will resist collapse, flotation, and lateral movement. So here are some things that we do not insure. We insure what is within the perimeter foundation of that structure. So we don't cover liquid gas or liquid storage tanks, propane tanks, structures that are more than 50% underground, swimming pools, hot tubs, fences, decks, driveways, landscaping. We don't insure those, what is within the permanent foundation. In contents, those are removable items inside of an insurable building. So we can provide coverage for not only building owners, but also renters. And renters are probably our least insured policies that we have out there, because there's nobody to tell them what their flood risk is. So they don't know if they're in the floodplain. They don't know if they're in the floodway. So it's up to an insurance agent when he's counseling their clients to say, hey, let's look up and see what flood zone you're in. Let's write a flood policy for your contents. We also don't insure livestock or motorized vehicles, with 2 exceptions. One is building motorized vehicles servicing the building, like a lawnmower, or a motorized handicapped wheelchair, but they both have to be within an enclosed building in order for us to cover it under the National Flood Insurance Program. Just like most homeowners policies, we limit to $2,500 jewelry, furs, artwork, money, script, things like that. We also exclude under building with a basement some building elements. We do cover things that affect the habitability. So the furnace, the hot water heater, sheetrock, wiring, plumbing, but we don't cover contents. There are 3 content items we cover in a basement: washer, dryer, food freezer in them, and a portable air conditioner. Otherwise, no contents are covered in a basement. So we describe a basement that is below ground on all sides. And I said we have limited coverage on building items down there. There's a list of those in the standard flood insurance policy. There are 17 items on there. And on contents coverage, those are the three things that we do cover. If it is an elevated building, elevated on piers, piles, columns, sheer walls, in a special flood hazard area, we cover those utility connections and the and limited structural elements. We'll put the sheetrock up. We won't tape it. We won't finish it. We don't do that. But we do, we do put that stuff back in. So we talked, I think, yesterday when we were talking about some of the legislation. So, I've been working the program for 4 decades now. When we first started policies, there was a 5-day waiting period. After the 94 floods, there were people who flooded the first time, didn't have flood insurance. And in the Midwest floods, there were 2 waves of flooding. So they went out, bought a flood policy, hoping and praying that flood insurance was not in effect on the 5th day when that policy was going into effect. So the 94 Act, the National Flood Insurance Reform Act of 1994, changed the waiting period to 30 days. The purpose of insurance is to buy insurance before you have a loss, not when you see it coming or not when it's happening. There are a couple of exceptions to those. One is at loan closing. There is no waiting period for a transfer of ownership. It is effective as of the date and time of that closing, as long as the premium is paid on that closing date or before. or there is a map date, a map change. In that particular one, if a policy is written within 13 months of a map effective date change, there's a 1-day waiting period. Now, the Biggert waters, because of the Waldo Canyon fire that we had here in Colorado, the Biggert Waters Act of 2012 added a third exception, and that is the post-wildfire exception. And we're dealing with this post-wildfire exception today. It's an exception, not a waiver. So in the post-wildfire, we cover damage caused by a flood that originated on federal land, on a policy that was purchased before the fire containment date, or before, during or before the 60th day of from that containment date. So right now we have fires that are ongoing. We have fires that are close to containment dates. We are monitoring that, FEMA is, but what we need in order to invoke the wildfire is we need to have water damage, or we need to have a flood that has been exacerbated by the wildfire involving federal land. So we are monitoring that. It is a case-by-case basis, policy by policy. So if an agent writes a policy today, and it is, on day 4 of within the 60-day containment date, and tomorrow they have a flood that either started on federal land or was exacerbated by a flood on federal lands, then we can revise the effective date of that. But otherwise, there's a 30-day wait period on that. So there are a number of factors that we use currently for rating a flood insurance policy. What flood zone is it in? What's the lowest floor relative to the base flood elevation? How much coverage? What kind of foundation? Is it a basement? Is it an elevated building? Is it a slab on grade? The occupancy, does it have, is it a single family? Is it a duplex, a 4-family, a non-residential building? Is it a public building? Is it a church? Those all affect how the premiums that we charge, as well as what's the deductible? There's minimum deductibles for both building and contents. There are maximum deductibles, $10,000 for a residential property and $50,000 for a non-residential property. And of course, as we talked earlier today, is it pre-firm or post-firm? Pre-firm, we have a subsidized rates. The program pays part of the premiums because that pre-firm structure did not enjoy any information about how or where it could be built. Post-firm is, as Kevin talked about, post-firm is any new construction on or after the initial flood insurance rate map for the community. And those dates don't change with subsequent map dates. It's always the initial flood insurance date. So to reiterate, pre-firm is constructed before the initial flood insurance rate or before 12/31/74, whichever is later. Rates are not based on elevation. Okay, we use elevation on. We can use post-firm elevation rates if there is an elevation certificate that shows that pre-firm structure, if it were built today using today's standards, we can rate that as a post-firm building, even though technically it is pre-firm. So that's one way that that structures can enjoy a lower premium. Post-firm are those that are on or after 12/31/74, which is most of our Colorado communities. So we're looking at the initial flood insurance rate base, initial flood insurance rate. And those rates are what we call actuarial. We have calculated the risk on what it would cost to repair or replace that structure, and those are the rates we charge. Rates are tier rated. We have a basic rate, and that basic limit that we have is applied with that rate, and then we have an additional limit and an additional rate that is applied to those. When it comes to base flood elevations in AE flood zones, easy enough with an elevation certificate to determine the rates. If you've got an unnumbered A zone, we talked yesterday about the yardstick approach, measuring the difference between the highest adjacent grade and the lowest floor. In that particular flood zone, the rate differential starts at 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. It's 2 to 4 and then 5 and above. The higher the elevation difference, the lower the premium. We do not use elevations on in non-special flood hazard areas. Those B, C, X, and D flood zones, they have just a specific rate that we have on that. So I think Kevin mentioned yesterday or yet today, and it was mentioned yesterday also, mandatory purchase. Mandatory purchase and flood insurance rates are based on the effective map. If there is any type of federal mortgage assistance tied to that loan, whether it's a federal agency, SBA, FHA, or if the loan is made by a regulated lending institution, they must determine whether or not a structure is located in a special flood hazard area. And if it is, they must require flood insurance. Lenders are also required to have more flood insurance if they discover that a property is located in a special flood hazard area. So when map changes are happening within the communities, and we have a lot of those going on in your communities now, they'll have, when the map goes effective, they will have their zone determination company determine whether or not their portfolio involved in that map change has been moved into a special flood hazard area. Now, the lenders have to require a minimum of the mortgage amount or the loan amount, the replacement cost of the structure, or the maximum available through the program. And currently, that is $250,000 for a residential structure. That is a 1 to 4 family residential structure, or $500,000 for a non-residential structure. Now, lenders can require flood insurance regardless of the flood zone. They have to if it's in an SFHA. As a matter of mortgage contract and due diligence, they can require flood insurance on any property that they have a mortgage on. So when constructing a building, get it right, and the flood insurance premiums will be affordable. The higher you go, the lower the premium. For every foot above the base flood elevation, it saves approximately 40% in premium. So Colorado has a 1 foot freeboard that they require for all new construction located in special flood hazard areas. So they're saving that property owner approximately 40% on that premium for that building. If you get it wrong, then the premiums go up exponentially. So if you, let's take Kevin talked about a flood-proof building having to minus 1 foot from the base flood elevation. If you build it to the base flood and we subtract a foot on that, that premium could be in excess of $5,000 at a -1. So when you're thinking about variances, when you're thinking about dry flood proofing for non-residential structures. Think about the premium. What's the cost of that premium? In fact, one of the things that you should do is in a variance or in a flood proofing situation is to have that property owner or that developer contact their insurance agent and ask what the flood premium is going to be if it's going to be built below the base flood. So we have, as we review our, review our map studies and update those map studies, we need to look at, is the structure located outside of the special flood hazard area? If it's inside if it's outside, we have the preferred risk. Preferred risk is a package policy that's available for non-special flood hazard areas. As we move structures into the floodplain through a map change, we have a newly mapped procedure for those that are going in that has a lower increase percentage as we move into the age of the map and the age of the policy to account for that higher risk of being now in the special flood hazard areas. Elevating structures on fill such that the top of the fill is at or above the BFE. We can look at looking at the letter of map revision based on fill to take that structure out. Okay, and that will, if it takes it out, moves it into a B, C, or X flood zone, and they can have a lower flood insurance cost or even eliminate the mandatory purchase of flood insurance. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. Removing a structure by letter of map amendment is for natural ground, is at or above base flood. Letter of map revision is where they've elevated that structure in the lowest adjacent grade and the lowest floor is above the base flood elevation. I know we had some discussion on that yesterday in the chat room. And I didn't know this. I didn't know it had changed even for LOMAs and letters of map revision. About 2 years ago, we changed the guidance. And yes, we are looking at the compliance floor to determine whether or not we're going to issue a letter of map amendment or letter of map revision. And I put that link to that guidance in the chat room this morning. Okay. Elevating for anything other than fill does not remove a structure. So if you're elevating on a crawl space or a stem wall construction, or even on piers or pilings, the foundation of that building is still in the floodplain and we will not remove it. So elevate floors above the base flood to reduce the cost of flood insurance, to reduce the risk. Colorado's got that 1 foot freeboard. And again, you could go higher than what the minimum standard is for the state of Colorado. But we recommend higher even than the 1 foot. It saves a tremendous amount in the cost of flood insurance. So some of the other considerations that you can look at in reducing the cost of flood insurance, if you've got zone A's, find or obtain a community-based flood elevation. You can get that. The Corps sometimes will help establish a base flood elevation. If, as I said yesterday, if you've got newer maps, get the technical study data notebook. Because we have estimated base floods inside of the model that we developed, that A zone. Get a copy of that and use that as your accepted base flood plus 1 foot for the state of Colorado. Take advantage of the newly mapped or even our grandfather provisions that we have currently under the NFIP. Grandfather is you buy a policy before the map changes, or when it's in a B, C, or X zone, or if the base flood elevation is going to increase. As long as you maintain continuous coverage, we'll honor those areas, we'll honor those conditions on that structure when it was policy was written or when the structure was built. And of course, if preform structures are above base flood, we're going to grandfather that along just as if it were a post firm building. So let's look at some cost differences. So these are really not current, but it just gives you an idea of how we can save premiums when we elevate structures. So let's take the first one. And the first one is you've got a structure that's 4 feet below base flood. The actuarial rate for that is on this example is $9,500. So you can see for every foot we go down, we're going to increase that premium because of the risk for that structure. If it were built to the base flood elevation, you're looking at $1,400 a year. Of course, these rates are several years old, but you know, it just gives you an idea of how we do rates. And then on the last one is where we've increased the lowest floor to 3 feet above base flood. It then becomes very affordable. It's about $427. It just helps those people who are maybe on fixed incomes or are low income communities or in depressed communities. The mandatory purchase is still a requirement if they've got a federal mortgage. Okay. There is also a requirement if they do get flooded and they get individual assistance, they're required to buy flood insurance in perpetuity if it's located in a special flood hazard area. We will provide a policy for them for the first 3 years. That premium's about $2,400 for about $71,000 in coverage. But at the end of that, they must obtain and maintain their own personal flood insurance. And if they're a pre-firm structure or a post-firm structure that's built below base flood, their premiums could be quite high. And that's when we get people walking away from their mortgages and walking away from their structures. And then that becomes an issue of abandoned property in your community. As I said, preferred risk is for outside the special flood hazard area. On current maps, they do have an underwriting or loss history requirement. They're allowed to have one loss to be eligible for a preferred risk policy. If on the second loss, then they go into what we call standard X zone rating. And right now that premium for maximum coverage is about $1,900. Okay. Grandfather will not preserve eligibility for preferred risks. So when it moves into a special flood hazard area, then we move into our newly mapped and our grandfathered options. And these are, the loss history is similar to the PRP. In fact, the rates are the same for the first year or two as a PRP. And then as the map ages, then we add a factor based on the age of the map and when the policy is effective. Okay, until we reach what we call full risk rate or actuarial rate, and that is that standard X zone. Right now, that's that $1,900. That's going to be their actuarial rate, and then it just increases based on our rate increases. So this is our deductible tables. You can see it depends on if it's a pre-firm or post-firm structure. You know what that base deductible is. The higher deductible you go, the lower the premium. We add a factor to it to reduce the cost of flood insurance. So as I said earlier, we have When we do our premium calculation, we're tier rated, which means we have a basic rate and a building rate, as well as a basic limit and an additional limit. For instance, on a residential property, the base limit is $60,000. So we take our base rate and apply that per $100 of value to that base rate, and that becomes the premium. Same way with the additional. So in a residential structure, the max you can get is $250,000. So that additional amount is $190,000. The key to this is that first tier, that basic, those are the subsidized rates. The additional rates are actuarial rates. So we're not charging a whole bunch of money for the whole building. We do average those rates, and then we apply the deductible. And then we have our ICC premium. That is, ICC is coverage D under the policy. And it has a premium varying on the rate table that we use. So is it a pre-firm, post-firm? Is it a non-primary? Is it a repetitive loss property? Is it a substantially improved building? So we charge a premium between $4 and $75. We are limited by law to that $75 by Congress. Then we apply any CRS discount to that, and then we add our fees on top of that. If it's communities on probation, it's a $50 fee we add. Policy fee is either $25 or $50. The reserve fund was put on through the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act in 2014, and that's to help the solvency of the program. Right now it is 18% of the premium that we have calculated, and then there's the HFIA surcharge. It's $25 for a primary residence and $250 for everybody else. Now we have those properties that are below base flood or in an unnumbered A zone where the grade difference to the lowest floor is less than 6 inches. And we call those submit for rate or specific rates. Actually, we just released yesterday for our April changes coming up in 2021. We just released those specific rate guidelines on what we will charge for those structures that are below base flood. In some cases, we do have a rate table in the standard rate table in the flood insurance manual where we can calculate the rate from 1 foot below BFE to, I believe, 15 feet below BFE, but there may be some other criteria that we may need to account for, like machinery and equipment, elevators, things like this. So now we can rate some policies that are below base flood. Okay, they run three times to 5 times. That's actually a little bit more than that for 1 foot below. And we used to be able to get all of the submitted documentation for those submit for rate properties. Now all we get on our new pivot system is certain criteria, but we have the ability to work with communities to determine structures that are below base flood, whether or not they may be compliant. You could have a compliant structure that's below base flood, okay? As long as it meets all the regulatory requirements, but we're gonna charge that premium for that, okay? We do flag these submit for rates when we're getting ready to do a community assistance contact or a community assistance visit, and we will ask you, why is this structure below base flood? So we also have our repetitive loss properties. Again, we've got 4 different definitions of repetitive loss. We have a CRS definition. We have a regular one. We have a severe repetitive loss. But essentially, a repetitive loss is 2 or more losses within the last 10 years that exceed $1,000 for each loss. Now, if you're a CRS community, then you've got a certain number of repetitive loss properties in your community, you are required to have a repetitive loss plan. How are you going to address those structures that flood over and over and over again? As we see in the next unit, there may be mitigation dollars available to you to address those repetitive loss properties, so you can get them, you can either buy them out or elevate them to the base flood to have a compliant structure. So Kevin talked a little bit about increased cost of compliance, ICC. I'm not going to rehash this too much because Kevin did a good job in going over that, but the policy coverage D allows up to $30,000 to bring a structure into compliance. Now, these are for flood damage structures only that have been substantially damaged, 50% or more, by flood, or they are a repetitive loss. They've suffered repetitive loss. Now, this definition is 2 losses in a rolling 10-year period due to flooding that equal or exceed 50% of the market value of the structure. So it's a separate claim that is applied from the damage to the building. So, you know, if they want to, if they are required by the community to mitigate that property, they'll make a second claim for ICC. And it will be handled wholly and separately from the original damage claim. So it's got to be in a special flood hazard area, and it's got to be non-compliant. Now you can have a structure that that was built to a compliant requirement, but if there was a subsequent map change that increases that to a base, the base flood to a freeboard to a higher limit, then we will be able to elevate that structure to what your current floodplain management requirements are. Okay. So our mitigation options, remember the, because you will probably have this on your test, up to $30,000 for flood damage structures to bring it into compliance. And our activities are floodproofing, the acronym is FRED, floodproofing non-residential structures only, relocation, moving it from one place to another, elevation or demolition. Now we can also use a combination. So if you're going to relocate it to another part of the property and you've got to elevate away from the flooding source, and you've got to elevate that structure to meet your base flood elevation, that can all be combined up to $30,000. Okay. We've talked a little bit about probation and suspension. Again, probation is the first step that we take to bring communities who are non-compliant into compliance to the floodplain management requirements. The probation will apply for up to 18 months, and the surcharge, which is $50, is added to every policy within that community. So if we put a community on probation and it's a PRP policy, they're going to see not only an increase in rates, but an additional $50 applied to that community. And that really is to encourage communities to be compliant, because you're going to get the phone call. Why am I being charged $50 for being on probation? And you're going to have to explain to them, well, we were out of compliance. Okay. It does not remedy the deficiency. It just accounts for the additional floodplain management or flood risk to that structure. If a community does not come into compliance, then we have suspension. No new or renewed policy will be written. As Kevin talked about earlier with the mortgage companies, the mortgage company can then, if they can't be compliant with federal law, they may actually call that loan. Okay. 1316, again, we've just as a rehash, it allows us to penalize an individual property owner who has gone through all of the legal hoops required by a community, fines, penalties, stop work orders, even jail time, to bring that structure into compliance. They will submit all of the documentation that the community has developed to try and meet that requirement, and they submit it to FEMA and request a 1316. We will then, for that property specific, put it into our database, and every time a policy, whether it's one from our Write Your Own companies or from our contractor handling the direct side, it bangs against that address, against the database, and it pops out as being a 1316 and not eligible for coverage. And it stays on that list until that property's brought that and that violation is corrected. So, as I said earlier, sometimes the regulations don't meet the floodplain, the flood insurance requirements. Some of the disconnects we have are better available data. You can use that to have higher standards, but we're going to rate the policy based on the effective map. Now, one good thing about requiring a higher standard is that even though it might be, let me give an example here. You have a structure that is that under the current map, it goes at base flood, but you've got a new map coming, or you've got a freeboard, and then we will actually rate the policy based on that higher standard. We get an elevation certificate. We'll rate it based on that higher standard. In the floodproofing arena, we always minus a foot. You elevate it to the base flood, which is all you require to do under the minimums. We're going to rate it at as if that we're going to subtract that foot that we require under the floodproofing. So you're going to use that -1 elevation. Treatment of basements. The regulations, we consider basements like any other floor, but we have limited coverage in those basements, as we talked about earlier. In V zones, we have the regulations allow up to, or allow enclosures as long as it is built with breakaway walls. It is, or if it's got openings required, if it's a coastal A zone, it's required to have openings. But we're going to rate for that enclosure greater than 300 square feet. Okay. Cobras are actually not regulated by FEMA. They're regulated by and otherwise protected. They're regulated by Fish and Wildlife. We just mapped them on, or we used to map them on our areas, but there are areas that are reserved for undeveloped communities that will contribute to lessening the wave action coming into properties. Otherwise, protected areas could be a wildlife preserve. And Fish and Wildlife enters structures into the COBRA zone or otherwise protected by legislation. So we've got the Coastal Barrier Resources Act that started the COBRA zone, and we've got the Coastal Barrier Improvement Act. One was in 82, I believe, and the other one was in 91. But what it does prohibit is federal assistance. So there's no flood insurance available in a COBRA area or otherwise protected. And there's also no disaster assistance available for individual assistance in those COBRA zones for those properties. So federal flood insurance is not available, nor is disaster assistance. So on the other side that we have, what we do have available is our community rating system. And that encourages communities to do things over and above the minimum standards. And the more you do, very similar to your BSEGs, your fire codes, the more you do, the lower the class and the better the insurance premiums. So we have class 1 to class 10, and each class you accumulate 500 points for each class to allow the discount in special flood hazard areas. For non-special flood hazard areas, the CRS discount does not apply to preferred risk or to newly mapped. It's only for standard X zone rates do we allow a discount for those premium calculations. We have in our region one class 1, which is Fort Collins. Most of our communities in CRS are either a class 8, 7, 8, or 9, which gives them a 5 to 15% discount. Okay, there's the classification table that we have. There are minimum standards. Community must be in the regular phase of the NFIP. Community must be in full compliance with the minimum standards. One of the options that we have when we're looking at communities who are non-compliant, if they're a CRS community, we can retrograde them. We can downgrade a class, or we can take CRS all the way away from them. In order to come into the CRS program, you must have a community assistance visit within 12 months and be in that full compliance status. As we talked earlier, there are certain requirements. You must obtain and maintain in perpetuity all new elevation certificates and substantially improved construction after you are entered into the CRS program. And we talked about the repetitive loss. If you've got a certain number of repetitive loss properties, then you must have a plan that you're going to use in order to address those repetitive loss properties. There are a number of websites that you can go to, coloradohazards.com/CRS. You also have our official website, CRS Resources, that you can go and get more information with regards to availability of flood insurance. What can you get credits for? I think there's like 96 activities that you can get credits for. You don't have to do all of them. There's public outreach, there's floodplain mapping updates. There is flood warning systems, things like that, that you may already have that you don't know that you can get CRS credit for. And there is a CRS a specialist that will walk you through the process to see what you can do. There's a in the CRS manual at crsresources.org. There's a quick application that you can run through and say, hey, I do this, I can get so many points, and I do this. You can self-evaluate on whether or not you've got enough points to come into CRS. And I think that is the end of this slideshow. Do we have any questions?
Yes, Caitlin asks, does ICC coverage have to be purchased prior to flooding? I think it's related.
Yes, good question. ICC is only for flood damage. However, for any other losses, whether it's a wind, a Mack truck hits the structure, under a property policy, there's an endorsement called laws and ordinances that will do essentially the same thing as ICC does, but it's for other perils besides flood.
Okay, that's the only question I see related to insurance.
Okay, so let me close this one.